Just let me pose to you guys a question. You don't have to speak the answer, but what is one thing you're facing right now that just feels too big for you to deal with? And I know that's such a loaded question. But what is one thing that you're dealing with right now that just feels too big to deal with? And I do really want you to think about the answer to that question, because I think right now in particular, the tendency is to pretend like everything is okay. And if you're great, I'm happy for you. Don't feel like if you're feeling great right now, if you're feeling at peace, if you're feeling like everything is in control, that's a good feeling because that's actually what's happening because our God is in control. But if you're not feeling the truth that you know, then I want you to think about the answer to that question. What's one thing you're facing right now that just feels too big for you to deal with? And so one thing I was thinking about is what can we do as a church? What passages of Scripture can we study to encourage us during this time? Where can we find hope? Where can we find truth? How can we speak to each other the truth of Scripture? Pray for each other. And one of my favorite stories in the Scriptures and favorite characters is Joshua. And so I thought, let's just go to the book of Joshua. One thing I love about Joshua is it's a story of conquest and a story of victory. It's also a story of God fulfilling his promises to his people. So today we're just going to look at the first little section of Joshua 1. We're going to get as far as we can. I won't teach a very long time because I know it's hard doing it this way. We're on our computers a lot these days. The kids in particular are getting like tons of computer time. So we don't want to keep them too long. But at the same time, we don't want to not meet together. And so just remember, as a church, we do have a Facebook page, a YouTube channel where there'll be some random teachings. We have a Spotify channel for worship. If music is your thing, lean into music right now. It'll speak to your heart. It'll uplift you and encourage you. We put together a couple playlists that you can look at from there. And so it's just a great time. So anyway, let's get into Joshua. And so what really we're going to do today is just look at Joshua's life in context. And I want to share with you one of my favorite stories about Joshua leading into the book of Joshua before we get into his calling with his conquest. So it says, just so you know, I have my Bible right here, so I'm reading from it. So it says this: after Moses passed away, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, who was Moses' assistant. Now, if we weren't careful, we could just read through that. Okay, Joshua was Moses' assistant. He helped Moses out, and we would lose the context. We would rush to Joshua going into Jericho and marching around walls, blowing the trumpets and the walls falling down and God giving him the victory. So I don't want to skip that, though. I wanted to pause and ask ourselves, what was Moses actually called to do? Because what we're actually seeing here is Moses had just spent 40 years of his life trying to take the people of God toward their calling and lead them forward. And if you remember back in Numbers 14 is when spies went into the land. Joshua was one of those spies, one of the 12 who went into the land, the promised land, and saw giants. And even before that, there was an Israelite captivity which had lasted 400 years, but God's promise was he would redeem his people. So he did the 10 plagues. They left their captivity there in Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, went into the promised land. 10 of the spies came back with a bad report. We can't do it. We can't win this victory. But 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, came back with a positive word. And it says there in Numbers 14, it's a fascinating passage. And if you have time this week, which I know you do, check out Numbers 14 because it's one of those great stories of Joshua and Caleb, Moses, are begging the people, like, just trust God, just trust his promises, lean on him. We know it's a big thing, but like we can really trust in him. We can do this. And it's this fascinating thing. In fact, I want to read this for you. Numbers 14, it says, then all of the congregation said to stone them with stones, but the glory of God appeared at the tent of meeting. So the people are about ready to kill Moses and Joshua and Caleb because they are speaking message of hope. They're speaking the message of promise to lean on the promises of God. And the people get so upset they're about to stone them and kill them. And God shows up to stop them. You know, like if you've been praying for God just to show up this past week, like that's just a great story of scripture where God just shows up. But what I wanted to point out with Joshua is where he was Moses' assistant. Now check this out. If we don't learn anything else today, besides being strong and courageous, I want to go to Exodus 30, 33, verse 7. And I just want to read this. Now, Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside of the camp, far off from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. So Moses used to go and pitch this tent, and they called it the tent of meeting. And those who were seeking the Lord would go out to this tent. And whenever Moses went out to the tent, all of the people would stand up. They would go to the tent door and watch Moses go to this tent to meet God. So like we just have to pause and realize how incredible this is. Like there used to be a tent that Moses would put up as they traveled through the wilderness for all of these years, for all these decades. And he would go out and meet God. And the people were so enthralled with this, they would get up and watch. And it says that when he would enter into the tent, a pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent. And the Lord would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the cloud, they're standing at the entrance of the tent, they would rise up and worship because Moses was meeting with God. And it says, thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. And as I read that this week, I was like, how many of us are longing for face-to-face time with our friends? And Moses had that with God. And let me tie that in just a few. But when this scripture says that Joshua was Moses' assistant, here's what it means. So when Moses would then turn again and go back to the camp, his assistant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from this tent. So it was Joshua's job as Moses' assistant to be there in this tent to watch Moses commune with God face to face. Like, what an incredible job as an assistant. Like that's a job that I would love to be a part of. And so when we see Joshua get the calling of Moses, that's who we're dealing with. Like, this is the man we're talking about. We're talking about the man who was so close to the presence of God day in and day out. He saw Moses every single time he encountered God. He was there. He was at the tent. He was experiencing God. And so that's our Joshua. Like, that's what we're dealing with. All right, so let's jump back into this text. It says this. So the Lord said to Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise and cross the Jordan, you and all of these people, for I am giving it to them, to all the people of Israel. For every place the sole of your feet will tread, upon which I have given you, just as I promised Moses. So what's happening here is God is calling Moses to fulfill the promise he had given. And there's one little truth I noticed in this. Moses has died, but the promises of God did not. And sometimes we put our hope and trust in people, and we put our hope and trust even in circumstances, whether it be family members or politicians or doctors, and we put our faith and our hope in people. But the truth here is that God's promises endure, but people may not be the ones who bring that to fruition. If our hope and dream in this case is in Moses, then the hope and dream has died. But the reality is the hope and dream was in the promise of God to his people, and that hope lives on through Joshua. And so the promise, and if you look throughout the Old Testament, it's verbatim, word for word, the promise God gave Moses, he reiterates to Joshua right here. So let's keep on. It says this, go to verse 5. It says, no, so this is the Lord speaking to Joshua. He goes, no man shall be able to stand before you all of the days of your life. Now put your hand up if you want God to promise that to you. No one can stand against you all the days. You'll win every argument. You'll win every battle. You'll get every pay raise. You'll never have to, like, I was reading that. I'm like, yes, God, I want that promise, right? Was it just me? Like, I want that promise. Yeah, I see that hand, Graham. Thank you. So I wish I could say that that's our promise here, but it's not. It'd be so great if God was telling out, no one will ever be able to stand against you. Everyone you go against will fall at your feet. That's not the promise here. Keep going. The promise is, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And that, maybe not at face value, but that's the better promise here. That's the one we have to lean on. And in fact, Hebrews 13:5 says, again, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And so let me remind us, church, that the promise is that nothing will stand against us. The promise is not that we will never have bad days. The promise is not that everything we put our hands to will be successful at. The promise is not that the economy is going to rebound in a certain amount of time. The promise isn't that our jobs aren't going to be affected or changed by this. The promise isn't that we're not going to suffer. The promise is that he will never leave us nor forsake us. And if you want to take time this week looking at that Hebrews passage, there's actually two conditions to the promise. It says, be content with what you have and keep yourself free from the love of money. And basically what that's telling us is trust in God for all these things. Trust in God for the provision. Okay, so final thought for you as I start to wrap this up. It says between verses 6 and 9, 3 separate times, be strong and courageous. Now I looked in the Hebrew about what strong means and what courageous means, and you'll be surprised to know that strong means to be strengthened, and for to be courageous means to be firmly rooted. And so there's nothing really to reveal there. Those words mean what they say. Be strong and courageous. And so the call is 3 different times. Be strong and courageous as you go into this land that I promised to your fathers. Be strong and courageous. And then it says this, to be careful to do according to the law of Moses that God revealed to him. And so what this tells us to do is to not to trust in our wisdom, our own comprehension, our own understanding, but instead to trust in the word and the promises of God. So as I look through Joshua, and as we're going to be walking through this book the next months or so, I don't know, I was thinking about what he had to face. You know, he had already been to this land once. He spied out the land. He saw giant people, so he knew he was going to have to face giants. He had probably seen walls built up of places that he was called to conquer, so he knew he was going to have to face walls. He knew he was going to have to face wars and battles and turmoil and trial. And so he knew what was coming. And so the encouragement of God to him is be strong and courageous. Lean on my words. Lean on my promises as you go forward. And so again, back to that question I asked you guys in the beginning, what's that one thing you're facing that feels bigger than you are? It feels bigger than you can handle, bigger than you can even maybe comprehend. Because let's be real, we're facing a lot of trials right now. We feel alone, or We feel in uncomfortable situations. We feel about an uncertainty with the future. We don't know what to feel at times, and that's a very uncomfortable feeling in and of itself. And so maybe you're trying to look to the future and you don't know what that's going to hold. You don't know what your job is going to look like, or your financial situation, or how your family is going to be. There's a lot of uncertainty right now, and I believe the promises of God is coming back to us. And the encouragement of God is be strong and courageous as we go into these promises that He's promised us. We're going to have to be strong and courageous. So a couple things that we can do, a couple takeaways, is to seek His heart, seek God's heart. And we do that through a time in the Word. I heard we were on a conference call a couple nights ago just talking, and there's a Corona resolution. And so like New Year's resolutions, but now that life has changed, why not make a resolution to change like today? And so if you're not spending regular time in the Word, we're kind of out of excuses. You know, if we're not having a time of prayer, we're kind of out of, like, there's plenty of opportunity to do that these days. More than likely, you may have a different type of job than the rest of us, but more than likely, you've got a little bit more time on your hands, a little bit. All of our extra activities have been canceled, so we've got margin to be able to do this. So why not use it to seek the face of God, to be encouraged, to be strong and courageous? So a time in the Word, a time of prayer, a time of worship through song, and then intentional spiritual conversations with friends. That's the first one, just seeking the heart of God. 2, seeking community for those that you long to be with. And I'm going to beat this, this reality. Connect with people that care about you. Connect with people that will pray for you. Connect with people that you can confide in. Don't let being at home lead you to a point of isolation and loneliness. And if you are in that place already, reach out. Ask for help. Reach out to me. Reach out to anyone in this church is happy to be a partner with you in this time. So that's number 2. And then the third one is to memorize and remember His promises. And that's just simply learning Scripture.